when we marched out the cost per case that we're losing, now we do about 19,000 cases at our two hospitals a year. We're losing, about almost $1,000 per case in hard waste and incapacities. There's 51 million surgical operations that get done in ORs in this country. If you march out these numbers, this is a $50 billion waste problem that we actually have the informatics and know-how to solve. If you look at something like diabetes or Alzheimer's, which each are $250 billion in cost a year, and you accept that sterile processing as a space in healthcare is at least $100 billion space a year, this is actually the one area of medicine I know that we have the capacity to solve in the next 10 years.
Millions of patients undergo surgical procedures every single day. Working behind the scenes are the technicians who go largely unknown, even to the patients whose lives are so traumatically impacted by their work. This is Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing. Join us as we explore this hidden world and introduce you to the unsung heroes driving the advancement of our profession. And now, your hosts, Hank Balch, Justin Poulin, and Michael Matthews. Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Dr. Peter Nichol, pediatric surgeon and chief medical officer of Medaware Systems Incorporated. Dr. Nichol is a minimally invasive pediatric surgeon and developmental biologist. He has helped develop the first and only mega analytics platform to serve customers, healthcare providers, and the biopharma biotech industry with the light speed analytics of the compendium of the entire clinical trials and clinical outcome literature. And we have an important announcement. Peter has been a great friend to the Beyond Clean team, and now he's joining us as our chief medical officer. Peter, we really couldn't be happier. I'm so proud to announce your participation in Beyond Clean and really just everything you've done since, as you describe in your presentations, you kind of got the bug coming onto the podcast a year and a half ago.
Yeah, Justin, this is all your fault. I'm thrilled and actually humbled to be here. This is really important, very important.
Well, you've done some excellent work diving in deep. I know that you've gotten your hands dirty, so to speak, and you've put sets together, and it's all part of your presentation that you did at Stanford and then again recently at IU Health. And I know that's going to be a big part of what we talk about on the podcast today. But honestly, I think you've got really some big picture ideas, and I'm just excited that you're going to bring them to Beyond Clean, in addition to some of the things that you've already been doing. But you're going to be part of our Speakers Bureau, and so that's something that's just coming new here as we get close to Isham in the next couple of weeks. And you're also going to be publishing a lot of literature, and we'll have that posted up on the website, let everybody be able to follow along with that. Maybe some of your ideas on what you want to do with the literature before we head into the interview.
Well, I think I told you this. I submitted 2 abstracts from our institution. One was basically a analytical dive into what the cost of waste is in sterile processing. And the second one was looking at really the sort of income inequality and how it's contributing to that waste. And I have a lot of ideas for this. As you know, in my presentation I gave back at Indiana, there's only a handful of papers, if you type in sterile processing in PubMed, that come up. And of those, I think it was like 100 or 110 with sterile processing in the title. And of those, about 60 of them had any kind of meaningful data in them. And when you look at diabetes type 2, if my memory serves me correctly, there were 1,500 times the number of papers on that disease process, that space in healthcare. And as we'll get into a little bit later, sterile processing is probably at least $100 billion space in terms of healthcare costs per year. So there's great opportunity here to really study how this is done and look at the economics of it, the linguistics of it, the performance of it, and the performance improvement of it, and really start to develop a canon of data that we can share with everybody on how to do this better.
Exciting things to come for sure. Also very excited to get into this podcast interview with you. This will be your second appearance on the show, and we're going to talk a lot about what's been going on ever since you came on 18 months ago. So, as a reminder, you can subscribe to Beyond Clean on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and Spotify, or search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. We can also be heard on the Sterile Education app available on iTunes and Android. Don't forget to visit us at the Isham Annual Conference and Expo. You can find us at booth number 256, and we are hosting our second annual myth-busting panel discussion on Monday night. Register now at beyondclean.net as space is limited. You can follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at BeyondCleanInfo, Facebook.com/BeyondCleanPodcast, LinkedIn.com/company/BeyondClean, and our Instagram is Beyond Clean Podcast. If you have a recommendation for a future guest or topic on the show, you can send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. Season 4 of Beyond Clean is brought to you by Anderson Products and Keys Surgical. Superbugs are evolving quickly. Is your infection control keeping up? Introducing the new FDA-cleared EO Gas 4, combining the proven reliability of ETO sterilization with a new high-efficiency microdose technology. Produces zero emissions to the environment and manufactured here in the U.S. with over 5,000 Anderson sterilization systems in use worldwide. Learn more at anpro.com. That's ANPRO.com. And Key Surgical, a leading provider of sterile processing, endoscopy, operating room, and instrument care supplies, committed to manufacturing and distributing the highest quality products. Key Surgical maintains the highest level of applicable ISO and FDA requirements. Continual dedication to personalized customer service and an extensive product line allow Key Surgical to serve the needs of hospitals, surgical centers, and more throughout the U.S. and internationally. Go to keysurgical.com to find a wide variety of instrument processing and protection solutions, as well as continuing education courses in sterile processing best practices. We'll be right back after a short break. Beyond Clean. Joining us now, Dr. Peter Nichol, Chief Medical Officer of Beyond Clean. Peter, really excited to get into this interview and see how things have been going since your first appearance on the show, at least to share that with our listeners. I know we've seen you at various events along the way, but maybe give everybody a quick update on your journey through sterile processing from 2017 when you initially wrote the article on optimizing surgical trays. And, I think you said you were using about 14% of the instruments in the tray. That obviously sparked interest from Hank and Mike and myself, and we wanted to have you on the show as a guest. We talked about that, but you really took a deep dive, and a lot of the presentations that you're giving at sterile processing conferences now to raise awareness is a lot about that story. So maybe share some of your experiences with everybody so they know just how deep of a dive you've been taking.
Well, if you remember the end of the beginning, which was in the last couple of minutes of the interview, Justin, you asked me a specific question. Do you remember that question?
I do. And it was tongue-in-cheek because I was playing devil's advocate, but it was, if we fix all of this, will the work go away? Will people lose jobs?
Right. And I said no, because healthcare is getting more complex. My hospital is turning into a critical care hospital. Our volume has gone up year in, year out. And I still believe that to be true. And then you said something to me at the very end of the interview about, you're going to have a lot of interest to be a speaker. A lot of people are going to be interested in you being a speaker. And I thought, yeah, sure, whatever. I didn't think, yeah, okay, great. This is fun while it lasted. And then you came back to me and said, hey, you want to speak at Stanford in November 2018. And when you contacted me about that, I had sort of laid down my sword and shield at that point, and then I had to pick it back up. Within about a day or so, I contacted my leadership in sterile processing in a panic, and I said, you have to teach me everything you can about this because they've asked me to give a talk at Stanford, and I don't know anything. I'll be honest. I'm a complete, open book with no print on it. And so then I took a deep dive. And I have to really say that even now when I go down into our SVD core, it really makes my head spin how complex that space is. But it reinforced a couple of things for me and also opened up some additional avenues for thought. And one was that instrument reduction so that you get 80% utilization is really going to be a major opportunity for savings for most hospitals. And when I say a major opportunity, so in my own institution, specifically within 2 hospitals that are conjoined in a 7-hospital system, we're losing about almost $7 million a year because we're reprocessing instruments that we don't use. Now, we live in a very robust healthcare environment where payer mix is good, a lot of HMOs. We get about 40 cents on the dollar. We have 3.8% margin. And if we were to pay for the waste, on instruments, we're going to have to book close to about $90 million a year in revenue. And that translates into probably another close to $200 million in new charges to collect on that 40% collection rate and that 3.8% margin to pay for all of that waste. So there's huge opportunities around waste. So that was one thing that became clear. But the other thing that became abundantly clear to me, and this is really, I don't have any experience in terms of high-end manufacturing, but I think I have sort of an engineer's perspective on this stuff. I was just appalled at the lack of organization, the lack of training, and yet the purpose-driven nature of the people who work in this environment and persevere to obtain mastery. Yet, in spite of all that purpose, there's a very high turnover rate and a huge amount of waste in terms of paying for locums, paying for overtime, mandatory overtime bonuses, having to replace employees because they get fed up and they go take a different job. And when I started adding up all those numbers, the percentage of unused instruments, the cost of that, which was 77 cents per instrument, and the HR costs, we were losing over $8 million a year in sterile processing just in those 2 areas. And that was absolutely mind-boggling for me. And so that really was the subject matter of the talk I gave at Stanford in November. There were other things we looked at, things that if you can stabilize your workforce and bring them in line with other professions so you reduce the turnover rates, and if you can address the issues around unused instrument waste, then some other things start falling out that are very important, such as you start dropping your error rates, and so your instrument delays go down, and so your lost overtime and capacity start going down pretty dramatically when you model this stuff out. So that's where this beginning of the next chapter started. And then you ask me, where are we now? Well, we have assembled a team at our institution, and I've got a dyad partner who's the senior vice president of supply chain, and myself working with a team to try to accomplish a number of things. And one is develop a retention strategy and also really kind of a growth strategy for the employees around education so that they have opportunities for personal growth and that they get appropriately compensated for that. And then to bring in technologies to try to reduce the number of instruments that are the unused instruments in the pans. And there's technologies out there that do this that are really phenomenal, but you can't do this without having human beings involved in this. This is stuff that just is not going to work unless you have people who want to champion it and take ownership of it. We're going to develop an ambassador program for the incoming surgical residents, so they have to go spend time in sterile processing to see how that works, see how that space works, so they have much greater empathy and understanding for it. And then they might have some insights in terms of how to solve problems on the operating room side. So we've got a number of things now that we're working on. We're also looking at how we're going to redesign the space. And we're working with a really great technical school in town to start developing a 1- and 2-year post-secondary education curriculum. And of course, with all that comes the battle for increasing the salaries so that people who go into that curriculum know they're going to end up with a really good job that's competitive in terms of pay and equal to other high-stress, high-tech, high-throughput jobs, because the big discovery in all this for me was how absolutely high-tech and how high-stress this profession is. And it really is a profession. The people in there are very purpose-driven and very aware that the instruments that they take care of are touching human beings and are critical in the delivery of surgical care.
Absolutely. And there was a couple of things you just said there about having the residents rotate down into sterile processing to get them that sense of empathy and understanding, and really to begin building a basis for working together as cross-functional teams, which is a theme I know you're going to talk about. But the reason I told you people were going to want to hear you speak is because you're really the first surgeon voice that's come out that really wants to champion this. And I think that you're going to have an amazing impact on the industry as a result of that. So no surprise to me. And the compensation discussion, I will tell you, is right up our buddy Mike's wheelhouse here. And it's something that we haven't shied away from talking about on this show.
It's actually kind of egregious what we pay people. It's frustrating because I can tell you that I can take all the money that we're losing right now because of not having a stable workforce, and I could stabilize that workforce and give everybody $8 raise, and I would still be saving money at this point. And then I'd have a workforce that can really help me solve the problems. Because when I go down that space, my head swims. There are people who go down there and actually can see it and know what to do. But they're so overstressed and overtaxed and under-resourced, they don't always have the opportunities to fix it, and they don't have the support. So I think fixing the salaries and really developing the educational component is really going to be critical for where we need to go, particularly with the kind of informatics and technologies that are coming down the pipe in the next 5 or 10 years to fix this space. And one thing, Justin, I know you know this, but when I published my second blog on this last year in 2018, I think it was in October. No, it was November. It was based on the talk I gave at Stanford. When we marched out the cost per case that we're losing, now we do about 19,000 cases at our 2 hospitals a year. We're losing, about almost $1,000 per case in hard waste and incapacities. There's 51 million surgical operations that get done in ORs in this country. If you march out these numbers, this is a $50 billion waste problem that we actually have the informatics and know-how to solve. If you look at something like diabetes or Alzheimer's, which each are $250 billion in cost a year, and you accept that sterile processing as a space in healthcare is at least $100 billion space a year, this is actually the one area of medicine I know that we have the capacity to solve in the next 10 years in terms of significantly reducing waste and getting towards the thing that you love, which is Six Sigma or Sigma 6 will reduce the error rates so dramatically that we significantly improve the outcomes. This is the one area that we can fix, but you can't do it without a well-resourced, well-supported workforce. It just won't work.
Yeah, Peter, I remember when that article came out, and again, just like the first one, it made tremendous waves because for the first time, someone had actually sat down and made those calculations out to extend, what is the cost out of sterile processing into the OR in terms of all those different kinds of waste. And then I want to go back, though, to a couple of these themes that you already mentioned, but I want to make sure that the folks understand how you walked through this intellectually when you're preparing for the different presentations and the most recent one here in Indy. Those 3 themes that you mentioned that became clear as you got into the trenches closer to the problems and the work in SPD. What were those 3 themes that came out of that? And then in terms of your response to them, what did you do or how did it change the way that you thought about these issues?
Number one was that SPD is a high-tech, high-stress space, without a doubt. The justification for that argument is that people come into, and this is partly from me going into it and experiencing this, and also me walking the Associate Dean of Health Education from Madison College, the big technical college, through that space. And she was prior to this, the Associate Dean for Manufacturing, Engineering, and Robotics at Madison College. And she said, this is a high-tech job. And the reason it's a high-tech job is that you've got complex machinery that really to achieve mastery on and know how to operate. And when it breaks down, you know how to troubleshoot it. You're looking at 9 to 12 months for the best people learn how to run this stuff. Second, they have to simulate a new and varied language around thousands of surgical instruments across multiple service lines, where the same instrument will have multiple names, and build pans around this. Third, they have to know how these instruments are being used. They have to have a component of empathy and imagination to project themselves into the minds of the people using instruments, but that are actually being in the OR in most cases, because most hospitals don't have ambassador programs. Number one, so that supports number one, that it's a high-tech job. Two, she said this to me, and I know this to be true, is we are never going to make a piece of machinery that's going to take the human being out of this space. We're going to develop technologies that are going to help the human being perform better and reduce things like human error, which happens at a constant rate, and stuff that occurs because of fatigue. But because we're going to introduce those technologies, people are going to be able to use their intellect and creativity in much greater ways to solve all kinds of issues that we don't even recognize yet as problems. And then third was that the greatest reducible cost in healthcare is waste. It is simply gold in the basement waiting to be mined. A healthcare environment with your reimbursements going down every year, insurance companies fighting about paying for stuff, you really are obligated to figure out how to streamline things to reduce that waste. And there's a compelling moral argument to do this, not just on the part of your employees, but on the part of your patients, because your patients are paying for that waste. So if it's $900 plus of waste per case, some of that's getting passed on to the end consumer, and they have to pay that. Now, in a state like mine, where 1 in 5 families lives in poverty, that can be the difference between being tipped over the edge, not being tipped over the edge, because that may suck up your whole deductible, and you have to pay that, and you don't have a means to pay it, and now you're taking out a loan to pay off those expenses. So we really do have a moral obligation to reduce the waste in healthcare, and by doing so, make it more efficient. So those are the 3 major themes, Hank.
Hey, Dr. Nichol, it's a real pleasure to be interviewing you. This is my first time to speak with you on air. And what's interesting
That's
is...
why you're calling me Dr. Nichol.
Yeah, I know. I'm still too fresh out of the hospital setting, so it's very difficult for me to call you Peter. But if you'll allow me, I'll call you Peter. It's very interesting because the first interview that Hank and Justin did with you, I was actually already agreed to be on the team. But unfortunately, I was working as a manager in a small sterile processing facility. The truth of the matter is that I simply could not afford the headset necessary to get on the interview process. And so when you start talking about compensation, you're talking about something that is very, very near and dear to my heart. It's something that I feel very extremely passionate about. And so I wanted to ask you that it may come as a surprise to many people that when we start talking about compensation, one of the biggest opponents that people run into are local hospital associations, because they say that we cannot talk about things like compensation for sterile processing because hospital associations will begin to oppose us because that makes our costs go up. How would you respond to that?
Well, there's 2 answers to that. So if you don't invest in your workforce, you're never going to get the waste to go away. And with margins of 1%, 2%, 3%, and our healthcare system's in a very healthy insurers market, okay? But a lot of places are 1 or 2%. Your best way to make money is to really reduce meaningful waste. And I'm not talking about flexing nurses or staff. I'm talking about how do we make the processes better? So that's number 1. Number 2, and I think you probably got put up to this question by Justin, if I know Justin at all, but there's this thing that I refer to as the healthcare poverty vortex. It's not really a cycle. It's really a vortex because it all goes downhill. But the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in this country is healthcare charges. And the leading threat to health is poverty. So if you are an institution with outward-facing values around community health and making people healthier, you do not want to be impoverishing them. So that hits it on 2 levels. You are morally obligated to reduce your waste, so you're not passing that cost on to your patients. 2, if you're really committed to that, do you really think you should be paying people at or below the poverty line, which is what's happening? It's not really consistent with those outward-facing values. That would be my response to all that. Having those values about community health really requires you to think deeply about those 2 commitments. And so I can't really justify in my mind, particularly it's a high-tech job. Look, like I said, I had the Dean of Health Sciences, formerly Associate Dean of Engineering, Manufacturing Robotics, walk through there and say, she said basically, this is organized like pre-Henry Ford assembly line stuff. Like, this is not a good space for them to do this work in. This needs to be better structured, better organized, and it's high tech. It's high stress. It's high throughput. There's tight tolerances. Find me another type of profession like this, and there's a number of them, and then pay people as if they're in those professions. You really need to be comparing apples to apples here. And right now, healthcare systems aren't seeing the waste, and they aren't thinking about the longer term. And, this isn't a waste that you fix on 1 year and you're done. This is year in, year out in a healthcare system where surgeries are getting more complex, patients are getting more complex, and the component of waste is only going to grow. That's my response.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I was at a hospital last year talking to the sterile processing supervisor, and he was just talking about how exhausted he was, and I was concerned because he was coming in very early and staying very late, but they didn't have a supervisor on the second shift or on the night shift. And I was asking him, like, how are you doing all this? And are you able to focus, when you're here at work? But then he shared that when he leaves that job, he was going to another hospital across town to go to another full-time job, 40 hours a week, in order to make ends meet. And again, I'm thinking, from the consultant standpoint of, is this person here, he may be physically here, but is he able to be mentally here for this job that has so much importance and attention to detail and specificity to get right, and you can't get it wrong? And can you do that if you're concerned that your lights are going to be turned off when you go home, or as you mentioned, that you're not going to be able to pay the bills that you need, to care for your family's health? It's easy to sit back and say, okay, HR did this calculation and we're equal with everyone else around us, so that's the end of story. But that's not even the beginning of the story as you're discussing here, because that's not meeting the need. There is this waste, and behind all this waste, there's these people who are just getting chewed up and spit out through the process.
It's terrible, and you're absolutely right. And in my town, our average salary, the take-home is about $19.60 an hour. Take-home after taxes, and this is not complete because there's certain things I left out, like deduction for children, and I didn't include things like auto insurance and all that. But their take-home after all that's around $31,000 a year. And then if you calculate what the cost of living is, it's about, at a minimum, it's $38,000 a year. And that's pretty bare bones. It's like going out to McDonald's once a week and catching a movie once a month and having one child in child care. And then on top of that, I'm not counting what they got to pay for parking, or that in my state, if they work in a university-affiliated hospital, 6.7 of their salary gets withheld to be invested, and they have to wait 5 years to be fully vested before they actually have access to that money. So it really, really stretches and stresses young families. Now, they get access to health care, but then they got a deductible they got to pay. So you're right. So HR tends to look at stuff in a very non-granular, mediocre way. What I mean by mediocre, I mean regression towards the mean. They look at, well, the average salary is this. Okay, you're looking at current or past data. What we're talking about is building a better workforce, better developed workforce that's better supported, that can help us solve these problems. They have to pay something to get that. And so if you're interested in the status quo, I understand your arguments, but that's never going to enable anybody to solve the waste. And as the Dean of Madison College said, you're never going to take the human being out of this. The human being is a very important part of that equation. And Hank, if I could just take the waste that we're losing, like I said, in human resource, because we're burning through employees and we're turning them over, and just give everybody a raise to stabilize the workforce, right there, I'd still end up making money.
Speak a little bit more about that waste, because again, in this compensation question, you're right. It's not just the issues in a vacuum. There's all this waste here that if we tackle that problem, there are funds available to not only use to improve the state of the workforce, but to do anything else you want with. And I know you alluded to this, previously, but how much money are we losing in these conversations, and where? Is it just contained to sterile processing? I know you mentioned that there's cost that floods out into the OR as well. Could you speak to those again, just briefly?
Sure. So if you want to just look at the HR cost of all this, and the numbers here are going to vary, but there was an AORN article looked at this and said, it's going to cost you $45,000 per lost employee. So $45,000 per employee. We're losing at least 10 employees per year. Okay, so that's $450,000. We got locums. We're using 7 FTEs of locums. Now they got to switch them out every 12 weeks, right? But 7 FTEs per year. It's about almost $96,000 per FTE. That's close to $700,000 in locums. Then there's overtime bonuses. This is not including sick leave, okay? So that's another $285,000. Those numbers alone, it's $1.4 million. The caveat being, Lisa Wakeman actually looked at, Lisa Wakeman down in Indiana. She looked at the cost of turnover and losing employee, and she calculated it to be close to $90,000 per employee. And my numbers are a little bit off because I just found out today that we actually have an additional 4 postings for locums FTEs. So this is probably closer to $2 million plus a year we're losing just because we're churning through employees. Now, that's just on the human resources side of things. We're losing every instrument we don't use is $77 an instrument, and we're losing another $6.7 million on that. But then when you start getting beyond this stuff, right, you start getting consolidation in other areas that help you with waste. So pretty clear, if you can reduce the number of instruments that are being used, reduce your pan size, employ some technologies, you're going to start reducing your error rates. Now, error rate's a combination of bioburden and lost instruments. If you get control of your inventory, know where all your instruments are, then all of a sudden your delays go away. So we did some calculations on delays. We got 38 ORs. We have at least 1 delay per day, at least. And that's during the case. I'm not talking about, when you go in and you open up a pan and something's not there and you haven't started the case yet, you're delaying the start of the OR, okay? But we figured it's about 8 minutes per delay, weighted average about $143 per delay, and we're looking at, another $8.4 million right there just in terms of delays. But when we start reducing the instruments, getting control of the inventory, using some of these high-tech informatics to track all the instruments, and then we can start counting instruments and stuff like this, we have much better control over inventory. Now your turnover times start going down. And when you're in a high-throughput surgery center where you're doing 8 cases and you're done by 5, maybe now you can do 10 cases because you've chopped 10 or 15 minutes off your turnover times, and each one of your cases is 35 or 40 minutes long. The return on investment for these kind of things, because you have a stable workforce, you can actually use the informatics, get you to the reduction in pan size and improve your utilization, it starts to multiply. And I don't think we really know how far this goes. I mean, we're going down the rabbit hole. I don't know how far the rabbit hole goes, but I'm pretty convinced that of this one thing, which is that we're about 50 years behind where they are in manufacturing and Sigma 6 and lean in the OR right now around sterile processing. Yet we have the technology to get there. Again, you can't get there without a well-developed, well-resourced workforce. And then so the educational components is going to become very important if hospitals really want to harvest the money from this waste. And it's going to be, like I said, Hank, complexity is going up. Complex cases are going up across the board. My hospitals are turning into basically intensive care unit hospitals. You know, it used to be you stay overnight when you got a knee replaced. Now they're sending them home because they just don't have the capacity to take those patients for a night. So complexities are growing. Waste is going to grow. We have to tackle this and reduce it now. But year in, year out, it will be a return on that investment. And I love to talk about and give my lecture on this. Everybody was willing to give Bernie Madoff all their money for an 11% return every year. Okay? We're talking about a 4 or 5-fold return on investment every single year if we attack this right. And yet people are balking at that, and I don't understand why.
You're hitting on a lot of very common themes that we've had throughout this run as our podcast, that, you know, we're talking about ROIs, we're talking about making those arguments to administration, talking about waste, all those sorts of things. So as we look at this $50 to $100 billion elephant, what are your next steps to start eating the elephant? You know, the common phrase is, how do you eat it? One bite at a time. So what's your next one bite?
At a time. You have to pursue this on multiple tracks. So one, you got to stabilize the workforce and give them a competitive wage. While you're doing that, this is what we're doing now, is we're partnering to develop training resources for a more advanced workforce. And we're doing that with somebody who actually knows how to do that, which is Madison Area Technical College. And so there'll be an apprenticeship component to that. The dean is now looking at what courses she's got laying around from other post-secondary education pathways that she can assemble. She's actually, she listens to a podcast, so she's going to hear this talk or this discussion we're having. And you guys are supposed to be reaching out to her in the next couple of weeks, I hope, to give her some feedback on what courses are going to be needed for a curriculum. And, it's going to be stuff on biology, systems engineering, informatics, water chemistry, probably some stuff on leadership, and to develop a 1 or 2 year degree program around this. We are also going to have to bring in informatics. So we're in discussions with a pretty cool company right now that has some interesting technology that can identify instruments from 20 feet away. And you can use that not just to track your inventory, but there are other ways you can use it to improve your capacities. For example, that will eliminate human error. So, for example, you need to count instruments at the end of the case, count instruments at the end of the case, do relief counts, and then for a lot of types of cases like, a liver transplant, a kidney transplant, a big open bowel case, stuff like that. And then you have to be able to do soft counts on things like sponges and needles, stuff like that. They actually have the technology to do all of that. And as I said earlier, we're not replacing the human being, but the advantage of some of this technology is it eliminates human error, and actually the human being can focus on the more important things rather than just the mundane process of counting, which in a high-stress situation, you're going to make a mistake at least every 90 seconds and then have to start over. So some of these technologies will have multiple purposes. So engaging some of these technology companies to build a better hospital so that your employees are in a better supported environment. Again, we're in negotiations with HR about what this is supposed to look like so that they have competitive salaries. And then looking beyond all this, if we can get those things accomplished, the plan is, it's going to take several years, but to get the utilization numbers in the PANS way up and bring instrument numbers in the PANS way down. And then to really start monitoring things like error rates and start reporting this stuff, like start publishing what our results are and sharing it with people. So the literature is one way to do this, publish in the peer-reviewed literature, talk about it on this podcast. I know you guys heard me talk about telementoring platforms where we have a hub that broadcasts out live to a bunch of people through Zoom meetings or through Skype and shares information or, reaches out to people and have them present their problems and help them solve their problems and distribute the information in the fastest way possible. So those are really the next steps we're focusing on. And then really beyond that, we're going to have to develop a track for education because you have to have educators who can keep everybody up to date in these spaces about all the changes that are coming around IFUs and technology. And right now, there's nothing like that. We have 80 employees. We have one educator for all those employees. And that poor person is drinking water through the fire hose. And then beyond all that, what we're finding is that there's no formal track of training for leaders in this space. That's going to have to be developed. So these are all things, this is a long-term game, right? But these are all things that we've got to get to if we're going to realize return on investments and extract the money from this waste in the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, Peter, this was a fantastic interview once again, and I think everybody's going to be really excited to track your progress. and they'll be able to do that on Beyond Clean. So I know you're going to be writing a lot of articles. There's going to be research. We're going to help collect that research. We're going to ask our listening audience to participate in surveys so that we can pull together the kind of data to push initiatives like this forward. I think this is a real game breaker for the industry. You're going to do the proof of concept, and then the whole goal is to share that with other states and other institutions across the country. And it's not a paid thing. It's about doing the right thing. So you're a great match for the team, and we love having you on board.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate it. Happy to be here. It's a privilege. It really is. Even though it's your fault.
Well, you can blame me. I'll take the blame. I'll shoulder that load, and we'll keep driving forward. I'm all about it. So that was Dr. Peter Nichol, now Chief Medical Officer at Beyond Clean. And boy, are we happy to have him aboard, Hank. And you know, that $50 billion opportunity, that's one that I've seen him present on twice. I know he refined and honed in on some things for the IU Health, and I even gave him some feedback afterwards. That whole concept of holding people at or below the poverty line, especially when it impacts their health, this I realize doesn't necessarily apply to frontline technicians in terms of their jobs on a day-to-day basis as far as what they're doing to impact patient safety, but it really is an extremely big factor. I know it's going to put a lot of pressure on people the more that we try to illuminate that concern, but if the data is there and the pay and the wages are there that substantiates that, I think this could have a big implication, especially when there's money to be had back in efficiencies. It's wasted money. So why not do it the right way and reinvest in these departments, especially as we all know the technology, and I know Peter eloquently mentioned this as well, the technology is only going to become more complex.
Yeah, Justin, we've talked about this a number of times, that it will not be sufficient to just raise our fist and say, pay us more or respect us more. We've got to make an argument from data. And one of the most provocative things about Peter's presentations and his articles and his research is he wants to make the data argument. And it is tied to ethics when it comes to compensation, but it's also tied to waste, like he talked about in the interview with us today. And that kind of conversation, if it's packaged and structured, can be transferable and it can be replicated across the country and across the globe, because as we've mentioned before, these compensation issues are not just a U.S. issue. It's a global issue in the sterile processing industry, how to recruit the best, keep the best, promote the best, and then through that, give the best care to the patients. That's what we're in this about. And of course, that's why Peter's joining the team, to be able to build this out on a global scale.
You know, I even think back to the interview with Allison Sonstely when we were talking about Career Ladder, and this was very early in season 1, but we were talking about Career Ladder specifically so that you could recruit talent into sterile processing so that they knew that there was upward mobility. But really what Peter's talking about is a game changer in the industry, that upward mobility and that career path exists within the department. That's really what's going to make a difference in terms of employee retention. So looking forward to seeing Peter's page get built out on the website. Everybody can track and follow his progress. And that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes or Stitcher and Google Play or Spotify. Simply search for Beyond Clean Podcast. We'd appreciate a rating and a review of the show because your feedback is important to us. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, or if you'd like to share a picture anonymously on our Instagram page, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank, Mike, Peter, and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.